Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the SPUC Youth Conference. It's so good to see so many here. Like my introduction said, my name is Margaret Akers, and I'm the Services Coordinator for SPUC. And I'll be able to talk a little bit about some of that work throughout the course of the talk this evening. My main job tonight is to introduce you to the topic of coerced abortion, which will be a thread that ties through much of what you'll be hearing this weekend. It's been an area of focus for SPUC over the last year, as we began to realize it's more prevalent than anyone had previously thought. Before I begin, it's worth acknowledging that some of you in this room here got to hear the first few minutes of this talk in October in Edinburgh, but were prevented from hearing the whole thing. That's because the talk was interrupted by protesters who made it clear that I was not going to be able to finish the presentation. Here are just a few things they said that night. This is not about freedom of speech, and this is actively harming people with uteruses today. I'd like you to keep those two sentiments in mind while you listen to me this evening, and consider the message that they found so dangerous. A common mantra of pro-abortion campaigners is "my body, my choice." We've all heard it. They even refer to themselves as pro-choice. However, we've often found this narrative of choice in our work to be a hollow one, and one that's not backed up by the lived experiences of women. Tonight, I would like to explore this with you a little bit further, and to call into question these ideas of choice and autonomy in the decision to have an abortion. Her Voice is an SPUC initiative which aims to give women a platform to share their stories of being hurt by abortion. I've had the opportunity to speak with many women who have had abortions that they profoundly regret. In doing so, I began to see a pattern in their experiences. These are all directly from women's stories. They said things like, "It wasn't my choice. My choice for abortion wasn't really a choice at all. I was only offered one choice. I believed I had no other choice. I felt I had no choice." Most of the women who have shared with me felt as though they had no choice other than abortion, but the reason why they felt this way varied. So why do women feel as though they have no options? Research shows that women, even women considering abortion, rarely see their unborn child as a threat. In fact, they tend to think of the baby positively. Instead, it's the external circumstances around their pregnancy that lead them to consider abortion as their only legitimate choice. These circumstances can include relationship problems, pressure from those around them, ongoing domestic violence, a desire to continue studies, financial difficulties, and lack of community or family support. Now, this is a matrix that I think is actually really helpful when we consider the nature of a woman's decision to have an abortion. On one axis, we have a scale from uninformed to informed. Now, that's being informed about what the abortion procedure entails and its risks, as well as being informed about the nature of the unborn child and his or her development. On the other axis, we have a scale from coerced to voluntary, and that looks at how autonomous and free from pressure a woman is at the time of her abortion. I think we would all be able to think of examples at the far corners of this matrix, right? We consider a woman at the far end of the coerced axis who is being dragged to the clinic by her partner, while a woman at the other side is what the media would like us to think every woman presenting for abortion is: empowered, certain, and self-assured. But really, most women will fall somewhere in the middle of this chart. And that's the kind of nuance that I want to get into it with you this evening. In the midst of what can already be a very fraught decision, many women are under a significant amount of pressure by those around them to have an abortion. And the research meets this out. So the BBC last year, around this time last year actually, commissioned a poll on reproductive coercion generally, so everything from tampering with birth control to coerced abortion, which we'll explore. Now, this poll was of British women. It was a general population poll of British women aged 18 to 44. And this poll found that 15% of that category had experienced pressure to have an abortion that they did not want. Now, that is not 15% of women who have had abortions. That's 15% of all British women. The same poll found that 5% of that group had experienced violence with the intention to cause a miscarriage, and 3% had somebody drug them, give them a substance, without their consent or knowledge, with the intention of causing an abortion. So this is a more prevalent problem, as illustrated here, than I think anybody had previously considered, and something that women are facing every day. Unfortunately, there has not been extensive research in this area. Most of the focus on reproductive coercion, which is a pretty new area of study, probably over the last decade, most of the focus has been on the sort of pregnancy promotion side of things, the idea of, again, tampering with birth control or anything of that nature. But not much research has been done to the opposite, and people have tended to see it as a non-issue, this idea of forced or coerced abortion. Coercion and pressure can come from a variety of sources. It can come from a partner who doesn't want a child, or a parent who doesn't think that their child is responsible enough to have a child of their own yet. Shockingly, it can come directly from medical staff, particularly in cases where a child has been diagnosed with a disability in the womb. And abortion in those cases is presented as the humane choice. Employers or academic staff can often make women feel irresponsible for pregnancy, and complaining about accommodating pregnancy and maternity can mean they inadvertently push women towards abortion. Coercion can be intentional and blatant. I've spoken with women who have had abortion appointments booked without their knowledge. But more often, pressure can be a lot more subtle. So just a more specific note on medical coercion. We'll actually get into this a little bit more this weekend, but just as a brief first note. After receiving a prenatal diagnosis of disability, it's sadly common for women to feel pressured into having an abortion by doctors and healthcare staff. Common experiences include being told that their child was, quote, incompatible with life, would live a life of suffering, would ruin their family. Some doctors still seem to have misinformed views about disability and may have negative and judgmental attitudes towards couples who wish to continue a pregnancy. As a consequence, they fail to provide the necessary support to families who have received difficult news. This is particularly egregious when you consider that the evidence shows that when an abortion is undertaken for reasons of a fetal abnormality, the after effects can be particularly traumatic for women. Here are just a couple of headlines from recent years of parents who are under significant pressure from medical professionals to have abortions. One woman shared that her doctor asked her over 22 times over the course of her pregnancy whether or not she wanted an abortion because of a prenatal diagnosis of Down syndrome. 22 times. Why was her choice not respected? And why didn't her no mean no the first time? It speaks to a real prejudice held by some doctors. And we'll be hearing more on this topic from Dr. Wyatt on Sunday morning, and he can speak from a greater range of experience. Now that we've had some time to think about coerced abortion in a broad sense, I want to get a little more specific. I want to look at individual experience with all its nuance and explore the kinds of pressures that women face. One thing that's worth thinking about is that coercion rarely just comes from one source. There's often a pile-on of opinions and influences, often independent of each other, that are on a woman that push her in the direction of abortion. A woman can be feeling pressure from a boyfriend at the same time as feeling shame from her mother, all while being told by well-meaning friends that abortion is the quote-unquote sensible choice. So what kind of thing could a woman be thinking or telling herself when considering abortion? Things like, he says he'll leave me if I don't have an abortion. My mom will kick me out if she finds out I'm pregnant. He said I can barely look after myself. How am I supposed to look after a child? My boss said I don't think we could survive another employee taking maternity. The doctor said the baby would have no quality of life. My baby will suffer the same violence that I do. The nurse said I only have a couple of weeks left to decide. I'll pause on this one for a moment because I think it's a significant one. In our own surveys, we found that most women felt rushed in their decision to have an abortion. Staff at hospitals and clinics speak to them about how much more difficult it will be as they get further on in pregnancy, which to some extent is true, but which also creates a sense of urgency that can drive a woman to decide to have an abortion while she's still actually ambivalent about it. It also can mean that she's making the decision while in full-on crisis mode and emotions and anxieties are high. So creating that sense of urgency really backs women into a corner to make decisions far too soon. So that's one thing to consider. And lastly, he says he'll hurt me if I don't have an abortion. There's another form of this one that's slightly different, and I think it's maybe more common. That is, he says he'll hurt himself if I don't have an abortion. This can set up a false me or the baby dichotomy that means women feel as though they're choosing wrong either way. And it's horribly manipulative, but it does happen. Now, it's easy to think that this sort of coercion only happens to particularly vulnerable women, those at risk of poverty or violence. But pregnancy creates with it certain vulnerabilities, and women who would have previously seen themselves as empowered and autonomous find that they're subject to this kind of pressure. And let's explore a real-life example. So this story comes from Mumsnet, the online forum. And you can actually find loads of things like this on Mumsnet. People share their experiences. And she shared how the father of her child made her feel as though she had no option but abortion. She writes, I wasn't able to tell the father for some time, but his reaction was even worse than I anticipated. And in just a few hours, he had convinced me to have the termination, and one day later, I was at the clinic. Until you've been in that situation, it's hard to see how it's possible for an independent and educated woman to be coerced in that way. And I know now I was so vulnerable with the hormones, I was really in no fit state to defend my wishes. Now, unfortunately, it's clear that coercion and pressure are not effectively screened for when women present for abortions and aren't identified by any staff. Women I've spoken with say that they showed signs that we would probably consider red flags, that they didn't want an abortion, but the abortion went ahead anyways. This woman experienced something similar. This is the woman from the same story as before. She says, the clinic was awful. I was sobbing the whole time. I was there and barely able to speak, and their aftercare was a joke. I know I walked in there and signed the consent, but I was in a terrible state. So let's look at that issue of consent a little closer. One thing that many people don't consider is how pressure and coercion impact on a woman's informed consent. Now, there's been a lot of focus on informed consent within the NHS over the last years, but it's been specifically on that idea of informed, right? Do you have all the information about all the risks? But I want to look at this idea of voluntary. So the NHS states that for consent to be valid, it must be voluntary and informed, and the person consenting must have the capacity to make the decision. And this is directly from the NHS. In this sense, voluntary means that the decision to either consent or not to consent to treatment must be made by the person and must not be influenced by pressure from medical staff, friends, or family. Therefore, women who have been coerced into an abortion have not given proper informed consent for the procedure and should never have undergone it. It's the duty of abortion providers in obtaining consent to ensure that women are free from external influence on their decision. They have continually neglected to do this, and in this way, they have seriously failed women. I'm going to make a couple quick notes about current political goings-on and the way that these intersect with this idea of coerced abortion, because it's actually quite important. So pills by post is a colloquial phrase that we use to describe the scheme brought in during COVID, where women under a certain gestation can be sent medical abortion drugs in the post, which they take themselves at home. This scheme has been made permanent. It is regular practice. The pills by post scheme leaves women particularly vulnerable to coercion in the process of their abortion for a few reasons. For one, a woman is denied the opportunity to speak to healthcare staff alone, away from those who may be putting pressure on her. There could be somebody sitting across the table from her while she's on the phone. Her abuser may be present for and in control of every step of the pills by post abortion, from the phone call to the taking of the drugs. And at no point is she provided a safe space to alert others to the abuse she is suffering. A poll of GPs found that over 80% of GPs were concerned that the pills by post scheme would leave women vulnerable to this kind of abuse. Another quick note, I don't have a slide for this, but across the United Kingdom, moves are being made to put in place so-called safe access zones, or buffer zones, which would make it a criminal offense for pro-life people to be present outside of abortion facilities, whether praying silently or offering help. This will deny a lifeline to women, particularly vulnerable women who may be being pressured. Often, this is the last chance, the last sign that they have to know that abortion is not their only choice. Later in the weekend, we'll be hearing from Isabel, who was arrested for praying outside of a clinic. And if you want to have your say politically in any of this, just speak to SPUC staff, and we'll let you know how to get involved. So really, what I want to leave you with today is this, and to carry through the weekend is this. Coerced abortion is abuse, and a type of abuse that often goes unrecognized. The legal and medical community must recognize this reality and work to protect women from it. Over the course of this weekend, we'll explore ideas more deeply about coerced abortion, while also gaining important skills to be able to speak on the issue, and call out these hollow ideas of choice and autonomy in the public square. What I hope I've illustrated this evening is that the prevailing media and public attitude to abortion does not live up to the reality of women's experiences. If we can start to bring this issue to the fore, we hope to be able to pull at some of those loose threads of the pro-abortion narrative and show people that abortion is not good and not empowering. We want to help you do this, which is why we've given you the materials you found at your seat. So, SPUC is a campaigning organization, and we're going to be tackling this issue from a few different directions. So we'll be in the parliaments tackling this issue with our elected representatives. We're also, if you're on our mailing list, you may have heard, we're taking a case through the courts of a woman who was coerced into having an abortion by her partner's family. We're calling her Lydia. It's not her real name, but we're calling her Lydia, and we're taking her case forward now. But there are some drawbacks to us as a campaigning organization. Sometimes it can be difficult for us to reach those who would be most impacted by our message. And this is where you can help. In these bags, you'll find a series of materials to help draw attention to this issue in your communities. They have some basic information about coerced abortion and can direct women about how to ask for help. They also point to a website. There's a QR code and a URL. They point to a website that has much more information on the issue as well, so some of the research and all of that. We're hoping to reach two groups of people with these materials: women at risk of coerced abortion and people who, frankly, haven't thought much about the issue and have bought into the prevailing narrative so that we can begin to shift their thinking. The best place to reach people is where they already are. So we're asking you to bring these materials to the places you already go: your university, the library, public transport, the pub, and leave them behind. We have cards that you can leave by the sink in a public loo or on your train seat when you leave. We have coasters that you can leave on the bar at a pub or on your table at a restaurant. We have stickers which you can stick on the back of your laptop or on a notice board. We also have posters which aren't included in your pack but are on the stall in the corner there. And if you have somewhere that you think would be a relevant place to stick a poster up, please take that away with you. So please take these with you and distribute them. If you need more, just get in touch and we can send them to you free of charge. You can even make an event of it with your university group or society and sort of build it into a social that you're doing. But please, take them and spread them where you go. So usually in the course of this presentation, I'm able to include the testimony of a woman who shared with me about her experience of coerced abortion. I've been very grateful in the past that she's allowed me to include her story in this way to help humanize this topic and provide a concrete example of what it can look like. I'm even more grateful tonight because she is joining us here in person to share with us in her own words, which will be much more impactful than anything I can share with you. So now I'm going to pass over to Hayley.
Hi, thank you for having me. very nervous for some reason. Okay, I'll try not to look down too much, and I'll try really, really hard not to waffle on or go in too many different directions. Now, some of you may be familiar with my story already because it's been used quite a lot in this campaign, and I also spoke at March for Life as well, so you may have heard it there. Whew. Okay, I'll start right at the beginning. So my mum chose life for me when she was just 14 years old. My dad was actually 22 at the time, and he tried to push her to have an abortion, but she chose life. She was very courageous, and I have so much respect for her. He actually disappeared from us when I was about 3 months old. So the only father that I really knew was my stepdad, and from the age of about 6, he became progressively more abusive, particularly towards my mother and myself. My mum finally left him, and she took me with her when I was about 13 years old, and that was the first time that I met my dad. So as you can imagine, there was quite a lot going on for me in my teenage years, which were already really complex for any teenage girl around that age. So my life was kind of spinning around me quite a lot at that time, and I went to live with my uncle. Not long after that, and I'd been staying there for most of my teenage years, it wasn't long after that I started to hang around with some particular friends who were on the estate that he lived on. One night while we were out and about, it was kind of around Christmas time, one of my friends invited us to a party, which is at their older brother's house. So under the guise of free cigarettes and alcohol and a warm house, we went along. I didn't go looking for anything. I didn't expect anything in any sort of way other than just somewhere for us to go. But there were romantic advances, if you like, made that evening, and I ended up dating the older brother. He was around 20, I was 15 years old, and he already had 2 children, who I met over the course of the next few days, and I absolutely adored. And as you can imagine, with the upbringing that I'd had, I was so desperate to be a part of a family. It was really quite easy to manipulate me into being in kind of the role of stepmom and feeling a part of the family. He was quite caring in those early days, and it was quite nice to be, or feeling loved as much as I'd known of love at that point with the men that I'd had in my life. I accepted that, and I was kind of grateful for it. That relationship deteriorated over the next few months, and it became progressively more and more obvious that I was a babysitter and there for sex on tap, basically, to put it bluntly. But to be honest, at that point, I was so hooked, I guess, on just feeling loved and accepted, and I needed to be in that space. Not long after I turned 16, I found out that I was pregnant. Things then took a much more ugly turn. Obviously, he was not happy about it at all. I told my family, they were not very happy about it at all. So I kind of felt like I was losing everybody. Really, it was made very clear that he wouldn't even talk to me unless I had an abortion. I was kicked out of my uncle's, where I had been staying, which was heartbreaking, to be honest, because I'd been so close to my uncle from a really young age. And so to lose his respect and for him to look at me so disapprovingly that was heartbreaking. And I ended up moving in with my biological dad, which you might remember I only met him when I was 13. He already had a new family, so I really felt like a kind of guest in their home. So I felt completely displaced, completely abandoned by everyone who I thought actually cared. But I was actually determined at that point that I was going to keep the baby. And I still even tried to maintain contact with him, and I was so adamant that if I just kept presenting my case, that it will be okay, it'll come round to the idea. But he didn't. A little while later, I moved back with my uncle. I felt it was really quite uncomfortable with my dad and his family. Very grateful for them taking me in. They tried their best, but obviously it was uncomfortable. So I moved back in with my uncle, which was the worst thing I could have done because he lived just around the corner. Invited me around to talk about things a few times. This resulted in me being pushed downstairs, punched in the stomach, all these kinds of things. And it was a lot of pressure that I was going to have an abortion. There was an occasion I was walking the dog with my little brother. My little brother was 8 at the time. And this is going back, Chelsea, I would have called her Chelsea, so I call her Chelsea. Would have been 23 this April. So this is going back quite a way. And my brother was 8 years old at the time, and he still talks about it now. It's how traumatising it was. But he actually drove his car at us, and we had to jump in the hedge quickly with the dog to get out of the way. It then, not long after that occasion, there was a girl started coming to my house, and I recognised her from college. We actually went to primary school together. We went to secondary school together. So it wasn't a massive shock that she turned up at my house, and she seemed very caring, and so she thought that I could do with a friend at the moment, and my gosh, she was right. I really could have done with a friend in that moment. Not that one, as it turned out. So I invited her in, and we started chatting over the course of the next few days. She started to drip feed. It was very clear that she thought I was in the wrong. I was forcing him to be a dad, and he didn't want to be. He already had 2 children. He didn't want any more children. It was wrong of me to be putting him in that position. And if I really loved him, right, I wouldn't do that. So she was really pushing that on me, and then there would be the comments about college. What am I going to do about college? Surely at the moment it's just like a course correction, right? It's just cells. Why would you do that to yourself? Why put yourself through it? Why put him through it? Why put a baby through it? Where are you going to live? So all of the fears that I already really had, she was really shining a light on them. And at the same time really making a case for this person who we call Scott for this. Eventually I agreed to speak with him. She had told me that she had spoken to him, which I didn't find odd because she was the girlfriend of one of his friends. And there had been a conversation, and he had shared how much he actually was just worried about me. He was concerned about me and just wanted to make sure that I made the right decision, kind of thing, and how would I cope and everything else. And I agreed to talk to him. And then the coercion took a different turn. And I think he really found what worked for me. The aggression and everything just kind of made me dig my heels in more. So he changed it up, and it was very much that he did really care, and in the future, he really did love me, and in future, we could try again and we could have more children. I could have lots of children, but right now was just not the right time. I was in college studying to do hairdressing, and he already had the 2 and didn't have a job, and just making his case in that way, like he genuinely cared. I'd already made and cancelled the appointment twice. On the 3rd time, when I spoke to the doctor, she made it very clear that if I cancelled this appointment, then it would be termed a late-term abortion. I was 12 weeks when I had the abortion. It would be late-term, and I'd have to travel much further. It would be much more traumatic. So it was, okay, I've got to do it now. So the day came, and he got me to borrow £10 off my uncle to put in his fuel tank. He and his friend come and collected me from my uncle's house and drove me to the clinic, where I was left outside. I was 16, petrified, feeling shaky and heartbroken and almost in denial of what I was actually doing. It's the weirdest thing when you feel it's almost like an out-of-body experience, like your feet are moving in front of you but you don't want them to be, but you're doing it and you just can't explain why. It was made very clear to me that if I didn't go through with it, I had no way home. And they left me there. So I went into the clinic, and I remember it quite vividly, really. I can remember the chairs and where everything was. I remember the faces of the women looking so sad, and they all had partners with them. I don't remember seeing anyone else who I thought, you're like me. They were all that bit older, and they all had partners with them. And that made me feel even more vulnerable, maybe because in that realisation that actually I'm a kid, right? The nurses were actually quite nice, and I remember one in particular looking really quite sort of concerned, and that was the lady who came over to me and said that I really needed to see the counsellor. Everyone has to see the counsellor. So I was taken into a room where I sat and spoke with her. Well, I say spoke with her, I didn't. That was kind of the point. She was speaking at me, and I said, I can't speak to you, because if I do, I will change my mind. And for the life of me, I cannot remember if I said it or if I thought it, but it was, he'd be angry with me. That was my reasoning. He would be so angry with me, and then I've lost him again. And at the moment, I've got him. So she said, okay, and she sent me back out to the waiting room. Now, I spoke to somebody quite recently, actually. She's a dear friend of mine. She used to work in an abortion centre. And she was a counsellor in the abortion centre. And I said to her, why would they do that? Why wouldn't they push that? Why wouldn't they think on that? And she said, well, they can't, because they can't coerce you. I said, how ironic, right? So I was back in the waiting room, and eventually a quite stony-faced, quite abrupt doctor came to me. I remember him being very cold. I kind of get it now, right? To do that job, it must make you quite cold. He came to me and he gave me pessaries. If you don't know what they are, basically it's tablets that you have to put up inside of you. It softens the cervix. It kind of prepares everything for what they're going to do to remove the baby. After about 20 minutes or so, you start to cramp. You know things are starting to happen. So I went in the toilets and I braced myself and told myself, come on, you've got to be a big girl, put on your big girl pants. You've got to do it, you've got to do it now. And I just did it. And then I regretted it immediately. A few minutes later, I remember asking the doctor, what happens if I change my mind now? He said, well, you can't. If you go home now, you will miscarriage at home. You will pass the baby away yourself. So there's no going back. So I sat and I waited. I had to wait for, I think it was about 20 minutes or so, until they'd properly worked and they came and got me. And do you know, I don't remember getting from the waiting room to the operating theatre, but I remember being in the operating room. I remember pretty much everything from that operating room. I remember the abortionist being sat at the end of the bed, looking very, very cold. I remember the anaesthetist on this side, doing what she needed to do with my hand. And I remember the nurse being sat next to me, stroking my head, just like your mum would, if you were in pain or something, you know? And she was saying to me, it'll be okay, because I was just sobbing and sobbing. I just couldn't stop crying. I was just overwhelmed. There was nothing that I could do. It was done. And yet it wasn't. It was, I was walking through it. And she's saying to me, it'll be okay. And the last thing I remember is looking at her and saying, it will never be okay again. It's the last words I remember saying. And then I woke up in recovery. And I now know I was in shock. I couldn't understand why I behaved in the way I did, why I said what I did. I remember coming around and there was beds down one side and beds on this side. And everyone's looking really sad and all these women are crying. And right, that's done then. I need to get ready, I need to go. And I pretty much jumped off the bed. And nurse came over and said, are you okay? I'm fine, I need to go. And I got ready and then I sat in that waiting room. I don't even know how long. I was the last to leave. They were literally closing up and I was thinking, nobody's coming to get me. I remember going to the toilet a few times while I was there and just praying that they hadn't done it, that the baby had somehow survived, because that happens sometimes, doesn't it? And I was thinking, maybe the baby survived, maybe, you know, by some miracle, everything will be okay. But I knew from what I was losing, there was no way. There was just no way. And there was no way back. Those sat in the waiting room and the nurses are looking more and more concerned because I'm sat there and nobody's coming. Eventually, he actually arrived to come and get me with his friend. I hadn't realised, but they'd actually gone into the city that we were in to meet up with some girls while we were there. And they'd come back to get me. And I was told I was lucky. He actually said to me, "You're lucky because I was going to leave you here." But he said that would be cruel. So I was going to get left there anyway. On the way back, I was crying, and so, "You're right." I said, "No, I'm in pain. Like, it hurts." He's like, "Oh, you're lying. You're only saying that because your mate said that." And just completely poo-pooed it, basically. We got back to his house, and I continued to cry, and I was told, "You're no good to me like that. You might as well go home." So I walked home to where I was completely alone because nobody knew what I had done. My uncle come home and was actually really upset. He had accepted that I was pregnant and he had accepted everything by that point, so he was actually really upset, and especially that I'd borrowed the money off of him to pay for the fuel to get there. And I just remember crying and crying the pain of that, not just the physical pain. It's like somebody has literally ripped part of your soul away from you and you just can't get it back. You can't do anything about it. I remember looking at a bottle of pills and just thinking, if I can kill myself, I could go and be with my baby. Sorry. I was like that for so long. For a really long time. I'd sit and just stare out of the window. I was completely broken, shattered into a million pieces. That was my wonderful choice. I don't know how long it took, but it got to a point I knew the only way I was going to survive was to tell myself I did the right thing. That somehow it was the right thing to do. That was what I had to do. I had to completely convince myself, and it was the only way I could silence people who were friends of his, who, if I did venture out of the house, I would be called a murderer and things like that. And I don't know if they even really believed it, but they just really loved to torture me. So all I could really do was own it. So yeah, I made the right choice. I did the right thing. She would be 23 this April. And there's still times now, not quite so much now, but I'll just think about all the things that she missed. Especially after having other children, right? Is something that you hear quite a lot from women who have had abortions, and I can certainly say it was true for me. All I wanted to do was get pregnant again. I just had to get pregnant again. It was almost like trying to replace what I had lost. Not that you ever could, right? But once I was pregnant, I was terrified that God would punish me. There would be a punishment. I would lose this baby. There would be something wrong with this baby. There wasn't. Praise God, there wasn't. He never punished me for what I did. He just loved me. But for every scan that we went to, especially the 12-week scan, that really hit me, because seeing her arms and her legs, this is with Ebony, it's my eldest, she's now 19, and seeing her moving around, and I was like, gosh, that was the stage that Chelsea was. What happened to Chelsea? I had no idea. Then there was first day at school, for Ebony, and there's that happiness, that moment of like, it's their first day, right? And you see the pictures, kids' first day at school, and it's great. And then that moment of, Chelsea didn't get this. I didn't get to do this with her. Every single milestone with each of my children is a reminder of the milestone I didn't get with that child. You can't replace her. You can't get that back. It was completely ripped away from me. So I get really infuriated when you hear people saying it's a woman's right to choose and that it doesn't affect women. It's because it's, oh wow, it does. And when I found out I wasn't alone in that I wasn't the only one, particularly I spoke to Rachel, who's at the back of Rachel's Vineyard. She was my first port of call. And she was the first person I really told my story to, my whole of my story. And the fact that she was like, have you had eating disorders? Yes. Have you had this? Have you had that? Yes. Like ticking all these things off. I had no idea that was abortion trauma. I had no idea because it's so hidden. It's just so hidden from view. And I don't exist as far as the abortion industry is concerned, as far as the media is concerned, because they're completely controlled by the same people. I don't exist, but here I am. I do. And if you look on her voice, if you speak to Rachel at the back, you speak to anyone, the befriender from Arch, the phone calls that you get, I've only done one. I've done one evening, and it broke my heart. I intend to do more. I am now expecting, and I've been struggling a bit with the sickness with that, so I haven't. But I will do more. But my goodness, they are out there and they are struggling, and they need people to be a voice. And the buffer zones don't even get me started, because what I would have give for somebody to be outside saying, you don't have to do this. You don't. Just to take me to one side and to have spoken to me. Maybe it wouldn't have made a difference. I like to think it would have. Maybe it wouldn't, but you hear of the women who it really did. I didn't have that last protocol. I hope I haven't bored you too much. I'll hand you back to our lovely